That works every time. Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. I'm John Mika, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation. Thank you for joining us this evening. This program tonight is the third of this year's Jack M. Templeton Liberty Series programs. And you'll see the next two are listed in your program, and I'm pleased to announce that we finally have our fifth in the series scheduled on March 2nd with John Stossel. So, yes, so if you are a series registrant, you're already signed up. If you are not, you want to sign up immediately. So go online, ask us on your way out, Kira or myself or Amanda, but John Stossel will be our final one on March 2nd. Tonight's program is presented by the Union League Legacy Foundation. The Legacy Foundation is the single charitable organization of the Union League of Philadelphia. We carry out the charity of the Union League. We use the history, the collections, the values of this great institution for programs like Good Citizen Day, for exhibits, for scholarships, and of course for the Liberty Series. Our goal is to educate and inspire our league members, the community, students, to be better, responsible, and more responsible citizens. We are not funded by member dues or any of that. We are funded simply through the generosity, the voluntary generosity, mostly from our members. And I thank all of the members, and talk about preaching to the choir, all of the members that have made a gift so far this year. I thank you. If you have not, I encourage you to make a contribution. Become a legacy leader. Help us present programs like this. Help us educate young people about the Constitution, about civics, about being better citizens and our future leaders. And if you don't know how to make a gift, we can show you the way. I'm looking at John Serlin, who's our chair of our development committee. Kira is back. Give a wave, Kira. Kira's, everyone knows Kira. She also runs our development program. Please talk to Kira. And there's lots of benefits to being a donor, and we can talk to you about that if you would like to know. So, few housekeeping items. First of all, please silence your cell phone. I'll take a moment, and I'll just stop while you do that, please. Tonight's program will run maybe 45 minutes or so. We'll have a Q&A as part of that program. A few rules for questions. First of all, please limit your question to a few sentences, maybe 3 or 4. Secondly, if you can't put a question mark after those sentences, you have failed. And now it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce the chair of the program committee of the Union League Legacy Foundation, who will introduce our speaker tonight, Mr. Steve Target. Steve.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure this evening to introduce one of the most influential political editors and writers of the United States, Rich Lowry. Rich graduated in 1990 from the University of Virginia, where he studied English and history. While a student at UVA, he edited a conservative monthly magazine called the Virginia Advocate. He went on to work as a research assistant for Charles Krautheimer, and then as a reporter for a local paper in Northern Virginia. He joined the National Review in 1992 after finishing second in a National Review Young Writers Contest, and in 1998, he was selected by William F. Buckley, Jr. to be editor-in-chief of National Review. Founded in 1955 by Buckley, the magazine has since defined the modern conservative movement. Today, National Review publishes a magazine 24 times a year in several formats, including print and digital. The National Review also produces a 24/7 website which publishes a commentary on major political and cultural issues, both domestic and global, daily. It also publishes multiple slideshows, podcasts, and videos on the website every day. In addition to his work at the National Review, Rich appears regularly as a political commentator on various cable networks. He frequently appears as a panelist on Sunday shows, including NBC's Meet the Press, ABC's This Week, Fox News' Sunday. He has published several books, including one of our favorite subject of the Union League, Abraham Lincoln, called The Lincoln Unbound. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our speaker this evening, Mr. Rich Lowry.
Thank you, everyone. Good evening. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be with all of you, so many people who value our country's history, its principles, and part of this institution that is really one of the glories of American civic life. So thanks so much for being here. Thanks for having me. Mark Twain once said that the ideal audience is well-informed, inquisitive, and drunk. So I don't know whether everyone imbibed enough for the cocktail party, but I hope we're 3 for 3. And I just want to say, for those of you who are Republicans, who live and work in or around this major urban area, I feel your pain. I live and work in New York City, and just to give you an idea of the isolated existence there, in the 2016 Republican primary, by the time it rumbled around to New York, I voted for Ted Cruz because I'm incorrigible, and my wife did too. And the New York Times has this amazing feature now where you can, the day after an election, you can go and look precinct by precinct in the city and click and see the actual vote totals. So I clicked on our precinct the day after. I said to my wife, wow, we were 20% of the Cruz vote in our precinct. Yeah, do the math, right? And then I looked to the precinct south of us, and there was one, and I was like, I know that guy. You know, he goes to my church. So as some of you may know, I myself and National Review have had a bit of a complicated relationship with President Trump. We very forcefully opposed him in the Republican primaries. There were shot fired both ways, but everything's fine now. It's all patched up, and the beginning of the rapprochement, at least for me personally, was after Thanksgiving break a couple years ago. I come back to the office after being gone for a while, and there's a brown envelope on my office chair from the White House. And of course, I'm very curious about what this is. I open it up, and it's a ripped-out copy of one of my columns from the New York Post. Now, I consider the New York Post the nation's newspaper, and more importantly, the President of the United States considers it the nation's newspaper. So he had ripped out this column I'd written right after the off-year election in Virginia, the gubernatorial race. And the guy who ran in that race, very good guy, friend of mine named Ed Gillespie, did everything he could to distance himself from Trump. He said, I've never met him. Please stop asking me about him. I don't want to talk about him, and got crushed anyway, because there's just this huge anti-Trump wave coming out of the suburbs from people who wanted to send an anti-Trump message, and they didn't care who they're voting against, right? And so Ed Gillespie just happened to be there. So I wrote this column about just how Trump is such a dominant political and cultural figure. There is no escaping him. And I had a lot of, I thought, incisive observations in this column, not all of them favorable to the president, but that made no impression on him. What caught his eye was the headline that the editors of the Post had put on this column, which was, "There is only Trump." And the president had taken out his black Sharpie, as he does famously, circled the headline, he drew a big arrow, and he wrote, "Rich, so true, Donald J. Trump." So, yeah. So that's like been the last 3 years for me. So if you allow me, before I start in earnest, to just do a little quick punditry, I think the bad news for Trump and for Republicans is if the Democrats manage to nominate a sane, rational candidate fully in possession of his or her capacities, they'll probably lose. The good news is there's zero sign that Democrats are actually going to manage to do that. And of course, we got impeachment going as well. And you know, Trump bears a lot of responsibility for always stirring the pot. But one reason I think there's just been this poisonous froth at the top of our national life for 3 years now, despite the fact that objectively conditions are wonderful, the other side has just never accepted his election. I went on a public affairs program a couple years ago, and I showed up on the set. It was during a break, and these Democratic analysts were already there ahead of me, and they're in a state of shock, and they're Rich, how long is this going to last? I was like, what? And they'd like this, like what? I was like, Trump's presidency. I was like, I don't know, 2021 or 2025, right? That's how it works in America. But they were dead set. There's no way that could possibly happen. And you've seen this from the left from the beginning. First, there was going to be a coup by electors from the Electoral College. Then there was going to be the 25th Amendment. Impeachment's been part of it from the beginning. There was even been notions at a time that Trump would resign, which, if you think about it, you're going to take a man who cares more about press attention than anyone ever probably in the history of the world. And you're going to give him the biggest bully pulpit on the planet. You're going to let him kind of drone people on the side if he wants to do that. And you're going to have it where he walks out to the helicopter every day, can talk off the cuff for 40 minutes with every network breaking into their news coverage to follow it, and then he's going to go to his helicopter, and a Marine is going to salute him every time he comes off and on. And he's going to give this up, right? He's just going to go away? It's just crazy. And there have been times, always when the walls are closing in, he's being driven crazy in the White House. He can't take it anymore. But it's been absurd. There's never been a moment when he showed the slightest weakness or the slightest crack, because this is not, as you might have noticed, a depressive personality, Donald Trump. And one of the reasons, there are others, unfortunately, but one of the reasons he says so many things that are untrue is this kind of natural tendency ingrained after 30, 40 years living in the New York tabloid culture, living in the real estate business, where nothing can ever just be good. It has to be great, like the most awesome thing in the world. It can't just be 100%. It has to be 110%. And I have a friend who had an advance guy who was working for Trump during the 2016 campaign and got an indication of this. Trump was at a rally in Roanoke, Virginia, and he was back in the green room. He hadn't gone out and seen the crowd, and we all know he cares about crowd size. So he asked this kid, how many people are out there? And the kid's like, sir, you won't believe it. There are 5,000 people. I've never seen an event this big in Roanoke, Virginia. It's packed to the rafters. And Trump says, that's amazing. 8,000 people? And then he gets serious. He gets on the phone, and he's like, John, I'm down here in Roanoke. You won't believe it. 10,000 people are here to see me. So anyway. Well, one of the things that happened in 2016, and one of the reasons he won the primary, despite our opposition, goes to my topic tonight, which I want to talk a little bit about for 20 minutes or so, and then happy to take any questions, which is nationalism, which is a phenomenon that the Democrats have totally turned their back on, and that Republicans had lost touch with the last several years. And it's an incredibly powerful force, an incredibly powerful baton, and it was just on the floor, and Trump instinctively, whatever, I don't know why, or how, managed to pick it up and make great use of it. So let's talk a little bit about nationalism. So first, just a definitional point. A lot of people think that everything good in national feeling or national loyalty is called patriotism, and everything bad is called nationalism. And this is a completely unsustainable and wrong-headed definition. If you want to get very technical about it, patriotism comes from the root of the Latin word patre, same root as patriarchy, father, fatherland, is loyalty to your own. Nationalism is something more specific. It's the idea or the doctrine that a distinct people, united by a common culture, a common history, and very often a common language, should govern a distinct territory. That's it. Very simple idea. So I want to submit to you 5 propositions about nationalism, and then I'll conclude and take questions. So the first is that this is a really old and powerful and natural force. There's some people who tell you, it's the Nazis that came up with nationalism. It's completely nonsense. So to illustrate this point, let me go to one of the great monsters of world history, Joan of Arc. okay? So Joan of Arc is a 12-year-old girl, maybe 13, I forget. She's in her father's garden, and the angel appears to her and says, you are going to liberate France. And France at the time is occupied by the English. The English kings are obsessed with the idea of not just governing England, but governing France. They originally come over from France, from Normandy, and at the time she has this vision. France had been occupied by the English for 75 years. The English had succeeded in putting their heir on the French in line to take over the French throne. Horrible civil war is part of this in France. Population is massively reduced by famine and bloodshed. And this teenage girl is convinced that she is going to stop this and rid the country of these invaders. And astonishingly, and it must have gone to incredible force of will on her part, she convinces the French authorities to let her give this a go. And famously, she is with French troops outside the city of Orleans, which is occupied by the English. And she starts sending messages across to the English troops. She says, I just want to let you know, I'm Joan. I'm here to chase all of you, one and all, from England. You should flee now while I have a chance. If you don't, I'll kill you. And this, of course, has about the effect you'd expect on these hard-bitten English troops. They mock her. They actually yell insults across the parapet. Here's this French whore who's sending us messages. And Joan does what any normal teenage girl would do when insulted in such a way. She cries tears of outrage and shame. And then she does what no teenage girl had done before or ever since in world history. She leads her countrymen in battle, riding a white horse, holding a 12-foot banner with the image of Christ sitting in judgment on it, and chases the British forces from the city of Orleans. Now, and actually succeeds in what she set out to do of getting the French heir back on the throne. Eventually, her run of success runs out. She's betrayed by French forces allied with the English, and the English take her, and they have a show trial with her. And the purpose of the long English questioning of her isn't to establish the truth, it's just to establish her guilt. They spend a lot of time on the offense that she had worn men's clothes, which suggests that probably the whole trans thing would not go over very well in 15th century England. But they inevitably find her guilty. They burn her at the stake. She proclaims the name of Christ as through this ordeal, and they take her ashes and they spread them in the Seine River. And she was 19 years old. And why did they do that? Well, the idea, we are going to eliminate all memory of this remarkable incident and of this girl. And of course, they do the opposite, because Joan had become a symbol of her nation, and as such will live through all time as a rallying cry to the French. When the French, century later, are occupied by much more hideous and evil invading army, the Germans, what is the symbol that the Free French forces use, that they paint on their airplanes and on their ships? It's the Cross of Lorraine. It's the symbol of Joan d'Arc. And when Charles de Gaulle, himself a formidable symbol of the French nation, dies, his home village puts up a 60-foot Cross of Lorraine to mark his contribution to the French nation. So in a nutshell, that is what nationalism is. So that would be my first point. My second is that this is a tradition that is part of the mainstream of American history. You would not get an American Revolution without nationalism. The basic proposition of the American Revolution is that there is an American nation and it should govern itself. It shouldn't be subsumed in an empire and ruled from an imperial center across the ocean. We don't get the drafting or the ratification of the Constitution without nationalism, because the basic insight is, unless we have a strong and capable national government, this whole project is going to fall apart and be discredited from the very beginning. You don't get victory in the Civil War without nationalism. So this is a tradition, the taproot of which is Alexander Hamilton, but it runs through Lincoln, it runs through TR, and you see aspects of it also in FDR and Ronald Reagan. Now, this goes to the fact that nationalism is very basic, it's a very plastic force, rightly understood. Both sides, both parties have access to it. If you haven't listened or read recently to FDR's D-Day prayer, you should. It'll knock your socks off. Donald Trump, when he was over in Normandy for commemorations, recently read it. And it's one of the great nationalist statements in American history, really a prose poem. So this is part of the mainstream of America. So any notion that it's inherently hateful and we have to turn our backs on it automatically totally misunderstands American history. Second point. So the third is that America is not just an idea, which is, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding. Now, people say this all the time. I know it may shock you that something that both Joe Biden and Lindsey Graham say might be false, but they both say it, and they're both wrong. No one lives in an abstraction. No person in their right mind, if you ask them, where are you from? Oh, I'm glad you asked. I live in Locke's Second Treatise, Chapter 5, Section 2. No, that's not the way it works. Nations are thicker than that. People are thicker than that. And if you allow me kind of a tourism hypothetical, if tonight in Paris, on the steps of the Paris Opera House, an African American meets a white American, they instantly have more in common than anyone around them. They speak the same language, they dress largely the same, they probably like basically the same cuisine, and they have this enormous stock and store of common cultural predilections and attitudes that are also, besides our ideals, a huge part of what makes us American. Another tourist hypothetical. If in a beer garden in Munich tonight, the Germans point to someone and think they're American, they're not saying, look at that guy, I can tell he believes in the Declaration of Independence. No, they probably say, look, he's loud, he's boisterous, maybe he's fat, he's an American. These cultural attributes can't be slighted in what it is that makes us who we are. Fourth point, just to delve deeper into the importance of culture. One thing that I was astonished by when I wrote my recent book on nationalism and I hadn't focused on. So the Massachusetts Bay Colony is founded in 1630, 1632, something like that. Puritans began coming over from England, and they had taken the charter that they got from the king to go start this colony with them. There was a loophole, a technicality they used to take it. They really weren't supposed to take it. They're supposed to leave it in England. And very quickly, they began to govern themselves through their own modes, more democratic than what you would have seen in England. They began to worship God their own way. And this upset people in England, especially around the king. So people around the king began to convince them, well, you know what you got to do? You got to go back and take the charter, right? They've taken this self-governing document to try to assure their autonomy, and we can't let that happen. So in 1634, this is 4 years into a huge element of the American project at the outset, the Massachusetts Bay colonists have to decide, what are we going to do? If the king tries to take our charter, what are we going to do? John Winthrop, the governor, sits down, and they have these conversations, and the decision is made that if that happens, they will resist this effort by force of arms. They train the militia. They arm the harbor. They put a light on the most prominent hill in Boston, which to this day is known as Beacon Hill. And this is just so astonishing to me, if you think about it, because 140 years before there was a revolt against British royal authority waged by independent and stubborn-minded people centered in Boston, Massachusetts. There was nearly a revolt against British royal authority waged by stubborn and independent-minded people centered in Boston, Massachusetts. And that just goes to just how deep and long-running the cultural grooves of this country are. And a huge element of that also is the King James Bible. This country wouldn't be what it is even today, when it's much more secular, if it weren't the fact that every early American had that Bible on their bedstand. It's from the Bible we get the notion that we are a chosen people, or as Lincoln said, more modestly and more appropriately, an almost chosen people. It's where we get the idea that this is a promised land, and it's where we get the idea of the covenant. And the King James Bible just provides, obviously, this amazing store of literary references and appeals to justice that rings throughout American history. Martin Luther King, yes, he did at times cite the Declaration of Independence, and that's very important, but the authors that were most important to his rhetoric and his oratory, it wasn't Thomas Jefferson, it was Amos, it was Jeremiah, and it was Matthew. And that idea of the covenant also just absolutely crucial to who we are. Because first, most important covenant in American history, the first, I should say, not the most important, but the first is the Mayflower Compact. And then basically every community and church that's founded on our shores is the result of a covenant. And the covenant obviously comes from the Old Testament. And it's very interesting because implicit in it is the idea that this omnipotent God can, even though he has all this power, can be limited. And if you enter into this agreement of mutual obligation and you fulfill your obligations to him, he fulfills your obligation to you. And we see this echoed in the most important covenant in American history, which is the United States Constitution, which is the sheet anchor of our sovereignty. So culture is absolutely important. And that brings me to my fifth and final point. So what would be, how should a nationalist think of, what should our agenda be? And for me, like a really lowest common denominator nationalism for someone on the center right would have a couple elements really focused on our culture. Number one, and first and most important priority, is defending the English language. Language is just hugely important to the unity of nations and to what we are as people and how we think. And the fact is that in countries where you don't have one dominant language, you get trouble. You look at nice, pleasant Canada, where nothing bad ever happens, right? Except for socialized medicine. But Canada, nearly torn apart, literally torn apart as a nation state by Quebec wanting to go its own way 20 years ago, because in Quebec, they speak French. It's a French-speaking province plopped into the middle of an English-speaking country, and it's caused problems. You look at Spain now, the ongoing contention over the status of Catalonia because they speak their own language, and because of that, they have our own culture. So we have to have an absolutely uncompromising commitment to English. We have to defend our founders and our heroes who are under a constant assault. And after these hideous neo-Nazis marched in Charlottesville, there was this disturbing incident in a church in Alexandria, Virginia, historic Episcopal church. And both Robert E. Lee and George Washington had worshiped there. So they had a plaque of Lee, and they had a plaque of Washington. And after this hideous event in Charlottesville, the decision was made to take down the Robert E. Lee plaque. I wouldn't do it, but maybe it's defensible. And to take down the George Washington plaque as being too divisive. That is crazy, but it is a sign of the times, and it's going to grow worse. And I would be not shocked if 20 years from now there is no such thing as a Jefferson Memorial anymore. And we need to resist that with every fiber of our being. It means forging an immigration policy that makes sense for our national interest and for Americans. We should be welcoming to immigrants, but they have to assimilate to our culture, not the other way around. It means defending our civil rituals and symbols, which means, yes, famous and well-paid athletes should stand the hell up during the national anthem. There is just, for me, no legitimate protest that involves protesting the American flag. And when people say people died for that flag, it's not just a metaphor, right? We're at an institution founded during the Civil War, and if you read about Civil War battles, men literally died for the flag. Color sergeants went into battle unarmed to carry the flag as a symbol and as a rallying point for their fellow troops. And at Gettysburg, very close to the spot where Abraham Lincoln gave his famous address, 5, 6, 7 guys shot down trying to defend the flag. In Battle of Fredericksburg, there's an incident where a color sergeant was wounded, hands the flag over to another color sergeant who's wounded, hands it over to another officer who runs to a dying officer so he can be wrapped in it. He was mortally wounded, so he could be wrapped in it and to breathe his last breaths wrapped in the American flag. The first African-American whose action led to an African-American winning a Medal of Honor was an African-American color sergeant who defended the flag. So this is something that goes very deep to our history, and for most of us goes very deep in our hearts and should never be disrespected. And finally, we need to teach a truthful version of American history. That means we should be forthright about this nation's sins, but we shouldn't lie about this country and tell its history as a tale of unrelieved woe and oppression. Instead, it should be told as the glorious story of a free people living in a blessed land. And in conclusion, I just want to leave you with a quote that I came across in the course of my research on this topic that I think really captures what I'm trying to get at in the thickness of nations, the thickness of national loyalty and our obligations to one another as citizens of this country. And it was given by a scholar named, a speech given by a scholar named John Thornton Kirkland, who would go on to be the president of Harvard, but don't hold it against him. This was in 1798 when Harvard was a much different institution. And what Kirkland said is, we have learned to love our country because it is our country, because we are near it and in it and have an opportunity of being useful to it, because we breathe its air and share its bounties, because the sweat of our fathers' brows has subdued its soil, their blood watered its fields, and their revered dust sleeps in its bosom, because it embraces our fathers and mothers, our wives and children, our brothers and sisters, because here are our altars and here are our firesides, because patriotism is the combined energy of the social affections, and he who can tear it from his heart commits sacrilege upon his nature. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich.
Thank you.
Do we have some questions?
Thank you very much. That was very encouraging.
Thank you.
But what do we do from here? Our children have been taught about socialism and not our capitalism. And we press to if we want a different language. And we've been doing it for a long time. So do you go back or and change it and fix it, so to speak? Or do you move forward, and how?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan, and I think this is part of the genius of Lincoln and his statesmanship. You move forward, but always the way forward is actually through your past and through your ideals, and realizing them better in the future. And on history and the lack of civic education, this is a fundamental threat to a nation. And a nation depends as much on memory as an individual does. So unfortunately, our schools are not just failing us very often, they are pushing the other way. So I wish this weren't true, but it's incumbent on us, as mothers and fathers and grandparents to teach our own children the history of the country and what it means, because you can't rely on anyone else to do it. Then it just means fighting also tooth and nail for schools to teach our history, and supporting, and there are a lot of good organizations out there, supporting any organization that's devoted to civic education and teaching the importance of citizenship and our history in our private philanthropy. So, look, I mean, we are fighting a battle that you squint a certain way, you're like, there's no way we're winning. This is a losing battle. And one of the more disturbing things, I mentioned trans, just in passing, but you'd almost think like there's a committee of a certain element of the American elite that gets together and they just decide, we're going to make something a thing and impose it on everyone. Like 5 years ago, they decided it was going to be trans, and here we are. You can't have, single-sex bathrooms anymore, right? Or you can't have women have to go to men's room and the opposite. So that's a really disturbing thing, because they're very powerful, but what we have to rely on still is the basic common sense of the American public. But we got to take the threat really seriously and and push back in every single way we can.
Question over here, Amanda.
Yes, hi. Jonah Goldberg last year was one of our speakers in this series, and his book, Suicide of the West, sounded a lot of the same themes that you've been talking about, but at least as I read it, kind of concluded that nationalism, or at least his view of what nationalism was one of the evils or dangers that we're facing. How do you square, his view with what you've said?
I don't square his view with mine. I think he's wrong. And he would tell you the same thing about me. We're like an old married couple on nationalism. We both know each other's arguments too well. But I think Jonah is wrong for a couple reasons. But I think most basic is, in the 19th century, modern nationalism, it was a liberal phenomenon. It was led by people who thought that nations should belong to their people. They shouldn't belong to monarchs, and they shouldn't belong to empires. And the traditional European empires in the 19th and early 20th century, they all fell apart. This happened to the Soviets as well, because as soon as the repressive apparatus gave way, all the peoples that were yoked together and ruled by someone else with another culture and another language, they didn't want that. They wanted to govern themselves. So this is a basic phenomenon you can't do away with, and if you try to do away with it, you have to suppress it by force. And then I believe the nation is kind of the most natural unit of organization for a society. It has scale, so it's bigger than a tribe or a given sect, but there's a sense of togetherness and a sense of we the people, as the Constitution says, that you need if you're going to have democracy or you're going to have a market. Because you need a certain amount of trust, social trust, right? And the example of countries where you have an insufficient sense of nationalism, sort of the post-colonial countries in the Middle East and Africa, if Jonah's right, nationalism is a terrible thing, these places should be glorious, success stories. But because tribalism is so strong, and the pull of sect is so strong, they have elections, but then people don't honor the results, and they have coups and they have civil wars because they don't have this sense of fellow feeling. So nationalism, it's essential to democracy, and I think also essential to market economics, which also relies on social trust. So I think Jonah is just wrong about this one. But don't tell him I said that. But you can tell him. He's heard it many times.
My understanding is the United States does not have an official language. And if that is correct, can you tell me your opinion why? What have been the obstacles against it?
We don't have an official language. And sorry, what was the second part? Yeah, I'm not sure why not. I think probably because most of our history, it would seem totally redundant and unnecessary. And it's probably one of these things, by the time you need to write it into law, it's too late to actually get the support to write it into law. So I just want to be clear, our culture can change, and it does change, and that's a good thing. It's organic and open. So an example I use, I grew up in Northern Virginia, and when I was a kid, there was one Mexican restaurant within driving distance. It was like a treat to go there. I remember one birthday, I begged my mom, can we go to the Mexican restaurant? It was so exotic. And now, of course, like everywhere else, there's a Chipotle, on every 10 blocks. And that's a fine thing. It reflects demographic changes in the country. But it's the core that has to be defended. And the language is right at that core. Why do we have ballots in another language? I don't understand it. Why don't we have an immigration policy that privileges people who already speak English when they come here? Now, that they're idiots who'll say, oh, okay, you just want white immigrants, but I think the most English speakers in the world are in India, right? And there are tens of millions in Nigeria, and there are all sorts of other countries where people actually do learn English. So it would help the cause of assimilation if you gave people extra points to come in if they spoke the language. So that's a long way of saying I do not know why it was never written in the law.
Is it fair to say that nationalism is about commonality and patriotism is about commitment to that commonality?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So the critics of nationalism, so again, Jonah would say, well, nationalism, that inherently involves us versus them. So what I would say, if we're going to get into the pronouns, nationalism means we. And you don't have a country unless you have that sense of we. These amazing stories that pop up every 6 months or so of, a Vietnam vet who has no family and dies, and they don't even know where to bury him or what to do with him. And some people get in the media and say, this guy gave sacrifice for our country, let's be there for him. And then you have, 5,000 people show up. That's we, right? That person, doesn't matter how poor he was, how unknown he was, he is part of us, and we are going to be there for him. That is like a nationalistic sentiment. Now, it can be carried too far. The us versus them thing, nationalism can become overly aggressive. It can feed into militarism. Like anything in our fallen world, it can be abused, and it has. But once it becomes the idea you are going to govern someone else, that's no longer nationalism properly understood. That's imperialism. And one of the glories of what this country did in the 20th century is we created an international system where we were going to respect the sovereign rights of other peoples and their right to govern themselves and say their borders are sacrosanct. And we created this system, and I think it's no coincidence that this system, based on the nation state, based on a sense of nationalism, has been more conducive to international peace over the last 50 years than what used to exist. So that's also a nationalist triumph. And just the last point on this, nationalism can sort of be analogized to a family, right? You don't choose your family, right? You don't really, even if you want to, maybe you don't even choose that much, choose at the Thanksgiving dinner table, right? They're just there because you belong to them and they belong to you, and there's nothing you can do about it. That's kind of, most of us, we didn't choose to be born here, right? We were just born here. So we have this sense of obligation to each other, and the sense of common understanding that knits us together more than we're going to be knit together with anyone else around the world. That doesn't mean, though, if you're committed to your family, you have to hate the family across the street. It doesn't mean that because you're American, you need to hate the French. You might disdain the French a little bit, but you don't have to hate them. And a true nationalism is based, and Trump has expressed this in some of his UN speeches, I think, quite effectively, is we have our culture and our sovereign rights, and all we ask is you respect ours, and we'll respect yours.
Amanda?
Rich, would you think that nationalism might well be an antidote to the growing divisive sense of tribalism that seems to be rising up not only domestically but also internationally?
Yes, absolutely. And I think identity politics is a threat to this country, is a threat to our institutions, If people become wholly devoted to their identity, their racial or ethnic identity, constitutional government as we know it, I don't believe will survive that. And the beauty of nationalism is critics of it will say, oh, it's small-minded. It's not. It's broad-minded. It's a loyalty that's above sect, above tribe, above partisanship. And that's why I think it's really important to foster. And it's not just enough for Republicans to understand this. Democrats need to get this too. And I think, so I'm going to stray more into political punditry here. I think Democrats, if they were acutely analyzing what's happened with Trump, they'd realize, okay, he's a populist. There's more room for populist economics. We can go to the left on economics, where we've traditionally been. You know, not like Bernie Sanders left, crazy, but at least further left. But counter to that, they should realize we need to go to the center or the right on some of these kind of cultural, sort of nationalistic issues. Give voters in the middle of the country just the slightest indication you don't disdain their values and you understand what they value. And they're just totally incapable of that. And they're just radically going the other direction, in part in a reaction to Trump. So maybe if he wins again this year, maybe they'll get it. But I sort of think not. And I think I talked to the opening about just how rejectionist the reaction to Trump was in 2016. If he wins again this time, I think it'll be even worse. I would not be shocked if there's a serious defiance of federal authority at some point from California in a Trump second term. I think things could get really crazy.
Rich, thank you for coming here tonight. What I'd like to hear more about is, and the Joan of Arc story is really fantastic, but now look, today in the 21st century, you have a more than ever before secular Europe. And here we have really a nation of religiosity, at least relative to Europe, and they must find this pretty strange. So where does religion, faith, fit into this whole discussion?
Yeah, so one, there's kind of the basic kind of cultural aspect to it that I discussed in my remarks. Two, the nation's not a religion, and nationalism's not a religion, and your highest loyalty should be to your God. Three, I do think kind of there is I can't prove it to you, but I think it's true, there's this relationship of religion and nationalism and commitment to a family that sort of all goes together, this kind of belief in a purpose, in a higher purpose, and a commitment